Welcome to the Homeschool Together podcast. Where one working mom and a stay-at-home dad help you navigate the nuts and bolts of the growing and dynamic world of homeschooling.
With a focus on early learners, like me.
All the ins and outs of building and maintaining your homeschool life.
Homeschool.
Find out tips and tricks to make things like this easier.
I'm reading.
And ultimately, enjoy educating your kids. And what's that last thing?
Have fun together. Did I do good, Daddy?
Yeah, you did, sweetie. Good job. Hello and welcome to Homeschool Together. We have a little bit of a deviation from our normal episodes. We like to review games and talk about curriculums, but we are getting a update on what's happening in the state of Washington. So a lot of our listeners all around the country, and a lot of people, you guys living overseas, might get a little window into like what's happening in our local area. And we've brought in Moselle Campbell, who's, I would like to dub the expert of Washington homeschooling, but she would not accept that. We just wanted to get kind of like an update on like what's going on in our backyard, and for people listening to kind of like extrapolate that out and wonder like what's going on in their states. So what's happening in Washington with homeschooling? We've had a huge surge in homeschooling in the last 2 years for an unknown reason. And we wanted to know kind of what's moving through, maybe what's happening at the state level, maybe some statistics, teach us, educate us.
Okay, so I guess the biggest news in Washington right now is there is a bill that the legislature is trying to pass right now. And it is actually set to lower the compulsory education age from 8 years old to 5 years old. Currently, Washington State has a law that says you do not have to begin any formal education with your child until 8 years old. Now, anyone who's going to go through the public school route mostly sends their kid to school at 5. They do the kindergarten thing, all that stuff. But homeschoolers in general tend to start educating their children later. The bill is SB 5537, and the compulsory attendance law that's already in place doesn't prohibit anyone from attending school. It actually just allows people who want to follow some of the scientific research that has come out about later education to do so. So even a family who is going to send their child to public school sometime in the future, they want to keep them home for a couple of years, do some education at home before sending them. Or a kid who maybe turned 5, 3 days before the cutoff, they want to keep their kid home for another year in order to help them be more socially or emotionally mature, that kind of thing. This bill went to the Senate, the Washington State Senate, in December, and it was pre-filed, and then they had a hearing on the bill. So they actually went through and they took testimony from parents, they took testimony from educators, and they had a lot of things go through to where it was basically hashed out essentially on the Senate floor. So in Washington State, you're getting some varied opinions. So when I wrote to my senator talking about the bill, I basically got a very generic response back saying like, oh, we're going to vote how we think is best, essentially, is what they told me. And I'm like, cool, thanks. So it was
you value my opinion.
Yeah. So the public hearing happened on January 14th, and they had a lot of testimony. They had a lot of written testimony. They had a lot of people kind of zooming in and doing testimony. They had people that were actually at the Capitol, and they had all these different things that were going on. So, the argument that was made from the senator who filed the bill was that, well, all other states or almost all the other states start at 5 or 6. Well, I mean, I was, when I was reading the Washington Homeschool Organizations, when I was reading their thing on it, one of their comments that really stuck out to me, it was like, well, I don't know about you, but because everyone else is doing it has never been a compelling argument.
Right. I feel like this is the jump off a bridge metaphor.
Right. So just because everyone else is doing it. So the state actually tried to make this change once before. And so when they did that, they have to go through all the stuff like, what is the fiscal note? Like, how much is the state going to benefit from this? And the fiscal note was $0.
Right. Is this something we get to vote on, or will this just be done at the legislature level?
This is going to be done at the legislative level, which is why they allowed the hearing and things like that. But the fiscal note was $0. So the state knew that every 5, 6, and 7-year-old that was going to be in school was already there. My personal belief is that this is a response to the huge numbers of people that have chosen to homeschool.
Are they trying to make it more difficult, do you think, for because people would then have to file declaration of intent
Exactly. They'd
for
have
a
to file
five-year-old?
declarations for a 5-year-old and for a 6-year-old, and they'd have to do their testing.
That's
They'd
it.
have to do their testing or assessment. And so if you're adding more requirements and restrictions, people are going to say, well, it's just easier to send them to school. Also, there's a whole host of families that try out homeschooling the first couple years of their students' education, and then they decide to continue with homeschool because they love it.
Mm.
So, without having that kind of trial period where their kid can stay at home if they're not ready, like emotionally or mentally ready for kindergarten, where their kid can learn at home to see if homeschooling is a good fit for them. Without having those couple years, you're going to see a lot more kids entering the school system early. I don't know how much research anyone has done on countries like Finland and, or sorry, Denmark, not Finland, who start schooling at like age 8. Overall, their kids are better educated, they're more well rounded, they're happier, and they're more mentally healthy than our kids.
Yeah, I think we read a little bit about there's some I don't know if it's Sweden or Norway. They also start I think a year or so later, like at 7 years old, and they don't go as long. I think I mean they have a little bit of a different idea of track for like high schools where they
Mhm.
go into more vocational and then
Yep.
kind of a college level. So we don't do that here. We kind of do the sorting after 18 years old or
Yes.
senior year, and
Which
so
makes a
they
lot of sense, right? To
yeah.
sort kids as they're just being kicked out of their parents' house and being told to just figure it out.
We're kicking our daughter out at what, 16,
So
17 or
we're
something?
seeing this new bill come up,
Right.
Yeah,
and I
yeah,
would imagine that other states are probably seeing other various bills. Maybe it's not about compulsory age, but
yeah.
I'm wondering if there's a general national trend to, institute small laws that just
Mhm.
make homeschooling a little bit more inconvenient
More sticky.
Yes.
because they have lost so many students
They have
to
lost so
homeschool.
many students, right?
Well, and I think most of the de-enrollment numbers have come at the lower grades, like those kindergarten, first and second
Exactly.
grades that a lot of parents, homeschooled, like we've talked to a lot of parents who started homeschooling at kindergarten and first grade level because of, for unknown reasons for the last 2 years.
They didn't want their
Yeah,
their very young children to have
very
to
young
do
children,
Zoom
yeah.
school, right? It's a lot easier to have your middle schooler do Zoom school than your
Right.
Yeah.
kinder or first grade student.
And I think, you have the analogy about boiling the frog alive kind of thing.
Sure.
And I think that when you institute small changes that are like, well, we can still homeschool. We just have to file earlier. We just have to start testing earlier. And so when you allow those small changes to be made that seem like they're really not going to affect the day-to-day lives of most homeschoolers, because really, I mean, in practical in the practicality of it, if you have to file an extra paper or get your kid an assessment, you look at that and you're like, okay, well, that doesn't seem like that bad of a change, right? And so you look at that and you're like, okay, so I can still homeschool. I just have to do this one extra thing. But then that
Mm,
like opens the door to like, okay, what other changes can we make? Can we require a specific test for or assessment instead of
mhm,
allowing families to choose like what works best for them? Can we require you to report your grades and test results to the state? Because you've already said, let us do this. So now
mhm.
why don't we just go ahead and do this as well?
Slippery slope.
Yeah. And so the other flip side of that is there is a group called Empower Washington, and I think that they have a lot of really good intentions, but they're not homeschool advocates. They are working on trying to get funding available. So if your kid doesn't attend public school, they're saying like you would get like I don't remember what the amount was. I think they settled on like 15 grand a year to use for your kid's educational needs. So parents could use that to help send their kid to private school or to, get some therapy that they weren't able to get at school or something like that. So like if your kid's not in traditional school, they're working on getting that funding. And when I actually went to a few of the early Empower meetings, and I said, you are only going to get homeschoolers on board if you make this a separate option, not as
Mhm,
this is under HBI law,
mhm.
the home based instruction for people who are not familiar with our terminology in Washington State. Something that's not under HBI law, but that's actually a separate option. I said, this is the only way you're going to get homeschoolers on board because if you make it tied into HBI law, and saying like, oh, your student has to register for these funds, and so they have to follow all the HBI requirements, you're going to scare off a lot of homeschoolers. And looking back, I'm like, okay, so this would totally make it easier for them to kind of push this funding through. So I wonder really where the source is coming from. And I'm not saying that it's coming from them, but I'm like, this ties in awfully closely to what these other people are possibly doing.
I see.
Interesting.
And I'm no longer attending the Empower meetings, so I don't know what's being discussed in them. At the beginning of the summer, when they stopped for the summer, I just never went back, and it wasn't really a conscious choice. It just didn't happen. And so it was one of those things that I don't know what's going on with that. But that is another big thing that's happening in Washington is they're basically trying to say if you don't go to traditional school, you can get funding and you can use that for whatever educational expenses that you want to use that for.
Yeah,
So
one of the concerns with funding, like a backpack funding type of thing, it kind of sounds like that.
Yes,
Very often there's a lot of strings attached, and
yeah.
what the
there is.
strings is, certain requirements, certain classes, whatever those might be. And for most people, I think what you were kind of alluding to is if there's a little bit of a resistance or a little bit of fear of doing something wrong, or maybe my student needs, doesn't can't move at the same speed as the schools, like what you were saying, like maybe the child learns at a different pace. Am I going to be, held responsible for that? Am I going, because
Right.
maybe his test scores are not correct for his quote unquote grade level, and we as homeschoolers understand there's no such thing as grade level. We move at the pace of the student. you know they don't have that same philosophy because they're, a big large bureaucratic system that makes people
They're
move
trying to
through
tick the
levels.
boxes.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't kind
Mm.
of run in that world, and so we're kind of talking past each other. And once you start getting a little bit of dollars, what type of requirements, or what type of requirements come in, and what type of fears do I have as a parent, and am I going to make a mistake? I know that's when we've interviewed other people across the country. They've talked about, there's a lot of things I got to check, and I got to make sure it's all correct and I do things right. And there is that anxiety that you make a mistake, and then I don't have that ability to homeschool, whatever that might
Right.
be.
Well, and along with that, I know that several, and I don't remember exactly when this was, so don't come at me for the year or whatever. But it was several years ago. They tried to implement a thing that you had to submit your test scores as as homeschoolers, and the everything was written to say like if you submit your test scores and they're consistently lower. I think you had to be lower for like 2 years in a row than like your average school or whatever, like your average grade level, then you would be required to enroll in public school.
And the flip side of that is if
Exactly. If they're failing in public school, they could have come back to homeschool. And I read that, I think, on Washington Homeschool Organization, but I don't remember when that happened. But it was like yeah, this is the flip side. So that, that proposal very quickly died because they were like, oh, well, no, then we can't do that. Because there are plenty of kids who fail year after year after year in the public school system.
Yeah, right.
And
Mhm.
so when you look at stuff like that, um, it's like, Washington homeschoolers have always really loved their independence. And we have more regulation than a lot of states, but I don't feel that the amount of regulation that we have is, I don't think it's stifling at all. I
Mhm.
feel
Yeah.
like taking a test or an assessment, they don't even tell you which one. They say you can do a checklist if you want. You can send in your stuff to a teacher. You can take a test. You can take this test. You can take this test, whatever. And so they do still offer us a lot of freedom. Filing a paper every year that says, "Hey, we're homeschooling," like that's not an inordinate amount of pressure on us. I don't feel like that's something unreasonable that the state asks of us. But we do like our freedom here. And so when
Mm.
you start to have the state coming in and saying, "We're going to change the way homeschooling works," you've got a lot of homeschoolers that are like, "No, you're not. You're not going to do that." And I think that WHO has been really integral in making sure that one, everybody knows about what's happening. I would not have known about SB 5528 unless I'd been watching the Washington Homeschool Organization page. I
Mm.
just wouldn't have known about it. Having those informational resources and having organizations like that that tell us when something's happening, has been really, really valuable in keeping us all informed of what's going on. But there's been a lot of other things too. Like if we didn't know, for example, that public schools aren't allowed to ask you, they're not allowed to ask you after you file your declaration of intent, oh, what are they going to be doing? What curriculum are they going to be using? Like if we didn't know that public schools weren't allowed to ask us that, then how many parents would be giving school districts ammunition to be able to file more bills and to do different things like that?
Yeah, and they do ask, we do
They
have
do, and they're not
rogue
supposed to.
school districts do the wrong thing. So these are two kind of, current issues in Washington State, which I think are probably national trends, which is
Yes.
the trying to get some put some impediments and difficulties between families and homeschooling, and also the concept of backpack funding. Do you see any other kind of trends or things on the horizon that like this, that's like, I feel like this is coming, or there's been some chatter about it?
So I think the biggest, and this is actually not a legal trend, this is just kind of a trend in general, and I think we're probably seeing this across the country. I'm seeing a lot of divisiveness within the
Mhm.
homeschool community. And there's a lot of, you're not a real homeschooler because you send your kid to a parent partnership. And
Hmm.
you are not a real homeschooler because your kid does K 12. And so we're seeing a lot of gatekeeping, I think, in the
Mhm.
community.
Hmm.
And while I agree that everyone needs to know the correct definitions for things, and I think that's important because when you blur the lines between, and I think that's where it's coming from, like they don't want the lines blurred between what's homeschool and what's public school.
Mhm.
I think that that's super important. And I think most people would agree with me that that's important not to blur the
Hmm.
lines. And that's where the hostile and the divisiveness comes from. I'm seeing just in the communities in general a lot of gatekeeping with that. Where if your parent partnership kids hanging out with your parent partnership kids and your homeschool kids hanging out with your homeschool kids, and you're not seeing a lot of like intermingling with the families, and you're not seeing a lot of that because there's such a hostility towards coming from the longtime homeschoolers to anyone who utilizes public school resources.
I feel like there's two, I've observed just around there on the Facebergs, a lot of hostility too between what long-term homeschoolers think of as kind of like fly-by-night
Uh
COVID
huh.
homeschoolers,
Yeah,
and that it always really bothers me. And,
me
and I
too.
know there's been splitting off of groups and things where people are like, oh, this is only for like homeschoolers that are really in it for the long haul, not just these
Hmm.
temporary people. And I think that's so, first of all, it's disingenuous, but I think that this is our chance as homeschoolers to give this olive
Yeah,
branch
right.
to all of these families who have been impacted by the pandemic and work situations which are off the pandemic and things. Anyway, they've decided to come to homeschooling for whatever myriad reason has happened,
Right,
and this is our chance to embrace them and show them that this is a wonderful, welcoming, supportive community that
right.
will help them. And maybe that, COVID homeschooler turns into a long term homeschooler. The
Right.
number of
Exactly.
people we have interviewed
Oh
on
my
this
god.
show who said, I started homeschooling because of the pandemic,
And I
and
love
now
it,
I
and
can't imagine not homeschooling the
yeah.
rest of my children's
Right.
education. Like, we hear that story time and again. And so whenever I see the gatekeeping, I grind my teeth
I
because
know.
I think, whatever definition you want to give people, or if you want to say somebody is, if you're here for 5 minutes of homeschooling or 5 years, we should all be supportive of each other because, we're all doing something that is out of the norm.
Right.
It's out of the path that has been set for us as parents in the United
Yeah.
States. Is okay, the kid turns 5 and then you do this thing, and then they turn 6, it's just,
Yep.
this is the path, and it requires literally no planning to do it. They just like
Right.
auto enroll you. It's like it's done. um you know we're forging our own path, and we are here, should be here to support each other. So
Yeah.
that's my soapbox, but I really hate that because
Yeah.
I agree.
I feel like this is our chance to show everybody that, homeschoolers are not weird, they're not antisocial, that their kids turn out to be well-adjusted, intelligent,
Yeah.
and valuable adult citizens, and that,
Yep.
maybe their kids should join the ranks of us homeschoolers,
Yeah.
even after the pandemic. So I just wish everybody was just more welcoming of, and I know that there's this huge influx of secular homeschoolers
Yes.
with the pandemic, and some of the religious homeschoolers, I think that's a little bit threatening to them. Like, this was a
Yes.
space that they kind of held on to. They
Right.
were definitely in the vast majority, and now that's kind of shifting too. So I think some of those folks are definitely worried about losing ground a little bit because they are homeschooling for value reasons, and
Mhm.
Hmm.
that's very important to them. And I don't think anybody wants to step on anybody's toes. I think everybody just wants what they feel is best for their kids.
Yeah, embracing the idea of
You
choice, I
know.
think, is maybe it should
Absolutely.
be more of like a meta argument above homeschooling, that homeschooling, whatever gradient you may have, that is choice. Whether choice comes from sending my kid to a Montessori school right down the street, or to the Christian school, or to just a regular secular private school, whatever it might be. It's just the idea of embracing choice and allowing people to have the choice that is unique to
Yeah.
them. I think that might be where I think the conversation should be going,
Right.
as opposed to saying, this is our little fiefdom. But I think that's
I think things are moving
Well,
on. I have
yeah,
I,
seen it move. It's getting better, I think,
yeah,
than it
yeah.
was at the beginning.
and I don't feel like anyone is intentionally saying like, I think it's a more of a visceral reaction to
Hmm.
that. I don't think anyone's intentionally coming in saying like, we want to keep this exactly as it always has been, and we don't want to let anyone new in, and we don't want other opinions. I don't think it's that. I think it's a visceral reaction to, we're just seeing this huge, just exponential growth in the community. And
Hmm.
so people are doubling down. They're saying, like, this is the way that we've always done it. And you're coming in with all your new ideas, and you're coming in. And like, no, but there's a lot of people that don't like change. And I think just
Hmm.
generally as human nature, we like to keep things the way that we've always known them.
Yeah.
And so when I don't think it's an intentional thing, I don't think anyone's intentionally trying to keep people out or, make people feel less than for homeschooling a certain way. I literally think that it's a visceral reaction to what's happening and
Hmm.
watching
Hmm.
the change happen before our eyes and not knowing how to control the trajectory,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
knowing how to control the effects of that trajectory, and having like just feeling out of control. And I think
Yeah.
that's what it comes down to is people feel out of control. And that's where the reactions are coming from, not from a place of hostility or hatred, just like crap, this is happening.
Yeah.
And like I don't like what I'm seeing,
Yeah. Yeah.
because it's different.
Well, and
Another
I think
element.
we as homeschoolers like to be in control.
Yeah.
Oh, for
That's
sure.
part of it, right? Like we want to be in control of our kids' education
Sure.
and what
Sure.
we're doing. And I think that there's a loss of control with
Hmm.
such a huge influx
Hmm.
of people joining
Well,
this.
and there may be another element as well. I'd like to hear your idea on this. As there's this huge influx. I mean, we went from maybe a couple million homeschoolers to like 10 million homeschoolers, and that
Yes.
now I think homeschooling for a short period of time might have eclipsed private school in like the size, just for like a short period of time. I may have my numbers, but like we're up to that level, and there may be some fear, in the homeschooling community who've been here for a long time, that we just want to be left alone,
Right.
just leave us alone. And
The
now
more
that there's
attention
so
that's drawn to it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Well,
the eye
and
of Sauron has turned on to us, and we now they
yeah,
that's, I think, where maybe you get a lot of those like anti public schoolers, that they're afraid that, as we discussed, that maybe legislation would come down and impact
absolutely.
what they're doing, and they just want to be left alone, right? Just leave
Right.
me
Well,
alone.
the public
Yeah,
Yeah.
schools want the funding. The public schools want
exactly,
the funding, and if they're seeing a huge loss of funding due to this thing, they're going to start to shift their attention to that. And so,
exactly.
and I think that you're right in that when people are reacting to this, they're reacting to, we don't want this kind of attention. We love homeschoolers and we love welcoming new people into our like small communities, but we
Hmm.
don't want such a huge influx that the government's like, maybe we put a stop to this, or maybe we put a lot of restrictions and make this a lot harder. Or maybe we get federal homeschooling laws instead of state by state. And
Oh
I think
yes.
that that's a huge thing too, is because we're watching the education system across the United States completely take a shift and take a new direction. And
Yeah.
so, the federal government might decide at some point that we are losing too much money, into our education system. We're losing too much out of our education system. We're losing teachers right and left because,
Yeah.
they can't handle all the stuff that's happened over the last couple of years. We're losing all this different stuff. And our federal education system is in trouble. So now we're going to take those laws and apply them across the board so that you don't have the freedom to do what you need to do in Texas or in Washington. Um,
Hmm.
or, I think Idaho has like no laws, or like they have very, very few laws. So someone in Idaho is like, well, what if they make it like New York and you have to submit your lesson plans every single semester? And you have to do all
Yeah.
this stuff. Like, what if they take the harshest states, and they take those standards and apply them across the board to create barriers for homeschoolers?
Well, and you know what and as we talked about this bill that's up in our state legislature right now is going to be voted on. I mean, public comment, yes, but we didn't have any opportunity to. I mean, they're going to get to vote on it without
Right.
the will of the people.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's where I think it's very scary because these laws
Yeah.
can be put into place without us getting a chance
Right.
to really fight it.
We do get to vote up down on a lot of things, with our
Yeah,
mail-in
Yes.
balloting, but it's
but this isn't one of them. So I
Mhm.
think
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting thought about just drawing attention and how things could shift, because definitely this huge public education system is driven by dollars.
Mhm.
And losing, for every kid that's enrolled in a Washington state public school, there's a portion of their funding that comes from the state. So if they're not enrolled, that's okay, that the state gets to keep that money. But there's a huge portion from the federal government that the state
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't get.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Your kid's not enrolled, you lose out on that money.
And
and
there's local
Right.
that
dollars too. Yeah, local city
and
and
that makes
region.
the whole world go round. So
Mhm.
I think
Yes.
it's going to be interesting to see what happens and to see if we see other states start to have similar trends with
Mhm.
seemingly innocuous homeschooling laws, like,
Yeah.
shift the compulsory, it's just not a big deal, everyone can still homeschool, we're not like changing it, just like you say, that kind of that frog boiling
Right.
in water.
We'll bristle like porcupines.
Well, that's the
Yeah.
thing. I think that, state legislatures don't realize
Yeah.
that homeschoolers have a lot of time on their hands and are very motivated.
I don't know how much
So,
time we actually have, but no, I'm just joking.
well, we can make time.
Yes, we
We
can.
can make time for
We
this.
we can make an educational day out of it and go down to the Capitol
Yeah,
building
yeah.
and talk to them then, because our kids are going to learn a heck of a lot by being there.
And I think
Uh,
that's what happened during the last attempt to make
A
those
lot
that
of
reporting
class field
that
Right.
trips
you
down
talked
to
about.
Olympia, yeah.
I think that that's what happened. A lot of homeschoolers ended up showing up on the steps of the Capitol building in Olympia, and they were not really prepared for that. So,
well, I mean, I think people often think of homeschoolers, and this is obviously not true, but people think of homeschoolers as either less educated, or they think of homeschoolers as, kind of like head in the sand, eschewing technology, like all this stuff. And like, you think of the homeschoolers in the 90s who, 10 kids piled out of a van all wearing matching denim jumpers, and who didn't have TV, and
right.
who didn't read anything that wasn't, from their church or things like that. So like people have this like really old fashioned and very inaccurate view of homeschoolers. And so I
Mhm.
think oftentimes politicians especially will underestimate us, which might work in our favor at
Yep.
times. They will underestimate like what we're actually like, the lengths we're actually willing to go to make sure that our way of educating our own kids is kept intact.
Mm,
Absolutely, I
that is
agree.
great.
Yeah, yeah, finding the uniqueness there. You run a Facebook group.
I do.
Could you tell everyone, we have a lot of listeners in Washington, about your Facebook group and why they should join it? And people all around the world if you want to get good information, but tell a little
Okay.
bit about your Facebook group if you could.
So I run a group called Homeschoolers and Unschoolers of Washington State. And I actually was not the creator of that group. I inherited it from a friend of mine who, there was some drama that happened in the group and it kind of blew up. And she was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And she messaged me and said, do you want to take this group over? Otherwise, I'm going to delete it. And there was like, I think 2 or 3 thousand members in it at that time. And I was like, well, don't delete this group. Like, there's so much there. So I was like, okay, I took it over. And it was a super snap judgment. um, and then she left. She just left the group completely. And I kind of started dealing with all the aftermath of the drama that had happened in the group. So I kind of came into it by accident. I didn't intentionally start running this group.
Mhm.
And so after a while, I kind of let everything die down. I started thinking about the direction I wanted the group to go in. My family differs from a lot of homeschoolers in the fact that we are fairly liberal. We're not red at all. We are a lot more blue.
Mhm.
Um, and so I wanted to make sure that the group was a safe and welcoming and inclusive space for people of all genders, all sexualities, people of all races, and that no one felt unsafe being in the group. Because homeschooling is a very typically, uh, traditionally, I wouldn't say typically, I would say traditionally, it's a very conservative method of educating your kids.
Mhm.
And so, because of that, I wanted to make sure that there was a group for everyone else. Um, and not just everyone else, but those people as well. Like, we are Christian, but we're liberal. And
Mhm.
so it's like I kind of am like straddling the fence on that a little bit. And so I wanted to make sure the group was a welcoming space for everyone, that we were giving factual information over the last couple years with everything that has gone on. Um, I've tried to keep it a place that adheres to federal, local, state mandates, that kind of thing.
Okay.
It's not always easy, and I miss a lot because it's hard. But I started, when I started running that group, I didn't know what it was going to become. Over the last couple of years since I took it over, it has grown exponentially, and I have probably 25 to 30 new requests a day
Wow.
to join the group. So a lot of them do get denied because either they're vendors that are only looking to come in there to sell to homeschooling families and they're not really interested in being part of the community, or they are from out of state and really, we don't allow people from out of state in there unless they're planning on moving to Washington.
Okay.
And the reason we don't is because it's a local group and I would like to keep it fairly local. So unfortunately, those listeners that are not in Washington won't
Sorry.
be able to
Yes.
join. That's okay. I just wanted to
It's a
tell you
great
guys,
group.
like, I'm
No, that's
sorry. Like, we do want to keep it local. Because a lot of the stuff that we discuss in the group is very state specific. And
mhm.
I wouldn't want someone coming and getting like homeschool legal advice in our group and taking it to Maryland or whatever and not being able to. I don't know the laws in Maryland, so I don't know if they would conflict or not. But taking it to like Maryland or whatever and then getting in trouble in that way. So we
Sure.
do try to keep it local because we want to really focus on Washington itself and how homeschooling in Washington might differ from other places.
Yeah, it's a great group. I've gotten a lot of good
Thank you.
advice there, and
Mhm.
it's really helpful. So, yeah, if there's any young homeschoolers or potential homeschoolers in Washington State, definitely join the Washington
Homeschoolers and unschoolers of Washington State.
Yes.
It
And we'll
was a
Yeah,
make
I
sure
long
know
to
it's a
name. I know.
yeah,
mouthful. I
that's
didn't
fine.
name it. It was already there.
Yeah, and
um,
we'll make
yeah,
sure to include a link below in our show notes so everybody can click on there and go ahead and
perfect.
subscribe.
And I will say too that we do accept people that are just thinking about homeschooling. We don't require you to already be homeschooling to be in the group, which is something that some homeschool groups actually require you to do. We don't require you to be already homeschooling, and we are okay if you're doing a parent partnership or if you're doing distance learning through your school district, or if you're homeschooling partially and your child's enrolled at the public school for a couple classes. Like, any of those things are okay. While we recognize that not all those things are traditional homeschooling, we also recognize that there's a huge shift in the way that education is perceived in our state and in our country. And there's more and more people choosing alternative options. And we
Mhm.
do want to be a space where anyone can come into the group and get advice. Like, we have people ask all the time, like, has anyone ever done K-12, or has anyone ever done WAVA, or has anyone, you know, done this online program through like Liberty University or anything like that? Like, yes,
Mhm.
those things aren't traditional homeschooling, but that doesn't mean that people who are choosing alternative paths for their child shouldn't be helped. And just like I didn't know the difference between homeschooling and parent partnership when I was, starting out, there's a lot of people that don't know that difference. And
Well,
so,
and I think there's a lot of people, even us, a parent partnership, that's only part of the story, right? The
right,
rest of it, the core of it is actually homeschooling at home. So a lot of
right.
the advice is still applicable, even though you're not legally, quote unquote,
Yeah.
homeschoolers.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not, but you're still, for most parent partnerships, you're still picking your curriculum. You're still
Mhm.
doing a lot of your stuff at home. Your kid's just going to science class or whatever at the public school. So it's not like
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
it's for a lot of people to use it as supplementary. And I will be the first to admit that at least for my oldest, we are not legally homeschooling, but we were for a very long time and we have kind of transitioned into that. So I want people in all of those areas to feel welcome into the group. Um, and to not consistently be told like, well, you're not homeschooling. And
Yeah.
it
I
does
still
happen a lot. And I do try
identify
to
as a
nip that.
homeschool.
I try to nip that in the bud when I see it in the group, but unfortunately, some of it does get through because I cannot stare at my computer 24/7. I'm a busy woman. So
Gosh, this was so great. Thank you, Moselle, for joining us. It's really got, I'm just thinking about so many things with, trends, and I'm very curious to watch how
We don't
these
talk
laws
about like
shape
kind
up.
of the politics of homeschool very often, so it was actually nice to hear. And you educated us on a lot of things that we don't have as much of a window into as well. And thank you so much for sharing that.
well, I would love to leave you too with something that there was a study done a few years ago, and this might help people understand and have some, like, not necessarily ammunition, but have some kind of basis when they're making their arguments, whether politically or otherwise. There was an article, and I will go ahead and send you the link, and maybe you can put it in the podcast notes if you want. But it was
Will
an
do.
article called "How American Homeschoolers Measure Up," and I'm going to pull it up right now, and it is. It's actually an infographic, which is really nice because it helps, but it does list those sources and things like that.
I love
Um,
infographics.
I know. Well, it's so great because it really helps, us understand like how the politics of things work. So it goes through a timeline of homeschool law. Like for example, like homeschooling wasn't legal in all 50 states until 1993.
Hmm.
Mm.
So there's a lot of like different things like that where you're talking about the politics of things. Um, but you know, when we're talking about education levels, different things like that. This infographic has a lot of stuff as to like why people are actually homeschooling. And this is a few years old now with the new influx. This may need to be reevaluated. Um, but for example, like homeschoolers rank in the 87th percentile for national standardized tests.
It's not bad. That's not bad.
Yeah, it's not the test scores. 87% of all students scored lower than homeschoolers. And that's
Mhm.
on average. But we're, consistently in the 80th and 90th percentiles across the board on almost everything compared to public school students. 25% of homeschoolers are ahead of grade. Their grade ranking if you're comparing to public school. You've got this thing has surveys from other stuff from homeschoolers on like whether they were happy they were homeschooled. Or when you look at, for example, 74% of homeschoolers continue on to college versus 49% of the general population. So you look at these statistics and, when people are discussing legalities, having this kind of data to share with people to say, like, this is why we're choosing this. This is what the benefits are. This is why we have chosen this for our family. And to be able to go to legislator and to be like, okay, like this is why we want these laws to say the same because obviously homeschoolers are doing their job because when you have 99% of homeschoolers have read a book in the past 6 months versus 69% of the general population, or $500 per year on homeschooling versus $10,000 per year per child that the public school sends. And so it's like you look at these, and so like this infographic is a really good thing for like when you're discussing politics, when you're trying to fight for whatever homeschool related cause that you're doing, having that data and those things are really, really good. And so, like I said, I will send you the link, and hopefully that it can be included in the podcast links.
Absolutely. We'll
Yeah,
definitely
we
include that,
definitely will.
and we'll make sure to share that on our Instagram as well.
Yeah, great.
Infographics are always helpful. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes,
And
You're
this
welcome.
was very,
fantastic.
very interesting.
I appreciate you having me.
Thanks so much for joining us today and making us a part of your homeschool journey. Please engage with us on social media. Join our Homeschool Together podcast group on Facebook and find us at Homeschool Together Podcast on Instagram. We'd love to hear your feedback, questions, and recommendations. Until next time.
Happy homeschooling!